Welcome everyone to week 3 of our reading group. To recap, we discussed the basics of private security and private law in week 1 podcast. In week 2 podcast, we discussed the meaning of justice and how the state doesn't have much incentive to stand for that. We also discussed how crime prevention can fail due to tragedy of the commons. This week we are going to discuss the topic of national security and how it relates to private security. The topic of defense is something that holds minarchists back. I myself went through a phase of what can be called a defense minarchist position. That is, I believe that we should just have a national army with just constitutional limitations on its actions. They would defend us from foreign aggressors, and the rest of the country could self-organize without a problem. As a libertarian, I had to reconcile the fact that taxation is theft, yet a minimal taxation would be required for the upkeep of the national army. And then I started believing that the nationalist sentiments of the country could very well see to it that the army could be voluntarily funded. Of course, that was before I delved into the economics of public goods argument. Now there are all sorts of hard nationalists out there that I'm not going to criticize nationalism. However, when those same nationalists use pseudo-economics to give scientific flavor to their arguments, that is where a value-free economist must step in. You're free to practice your beliefs, but when you make scientific claims, you need to back it up as a scientist would. The biggest argument for a national defense is the public goods argument. People nowadays have this sort of mixed economics belief, where they believe that there are certain goods which can be best provided by the so-called capitalist portion of the economy, like clothes, mobile phones, internet connectivity, etc. I would have said food, but that is also debated vigorously, especially in India. These goods are called private goods. Then they believe that there are certain goods that cannot be produced by capitalist mode of production at all. The government must therefore either take over the production process itself, or support those industries, even if private players are involved. Let us for now think like a descriptive economist rather than a prescriptive one. That is, we will be using economics to explain the world as it is rather than give it policy prescriptions. The explanation that is given for why certain goods need to be public are usually twofold. First is the non-excludability argument. That is, if I am providing a service that I can't exclude non-payers from consuming, it is a non-excludable good, like lighthouses. Ships could very well pay the lighthouse to function, but the light itself is non-excludable. If a lighthouse is functioning, it functions for all the ships, even the ones who do not pay for its upkeep. Those ships become free riders. And we can see that every ship has an incentive to free ride. The argument then becomes that even though all ships want a lighthouse, the lighthouse won't be built because the group of sailors who invest in constructing it would not be able to exclude those who did not. So the government had to construct lighthouses. Second factor that they say contributes to a good becoming private good is the non-rivalrous consumption. Like in a movie theater, if one person is watching a movie, that does not reduce the possible consumption of the movie by another person sitting in the same cinema hall. Whereas as opposed to if you're a seller and you're selling potatoes, if one customer has bought potatoes from me, the next customer has lesser choice to buy. It might even be that my potatoes are over by the time he gets here. So it's non-rivalrous. So it is rivalrous. Here the argument is not lack of incentives for the consumers to pay, but because you can exclude them if they can't free ride, but rather the lack of incentives for competition, which they say will result in a natural monopoly. National defense is the ultimate example of a public good because it is both non-excludable and non-rivalrous. If the border is being defended, neither can you exclude the non-players. If the army functioned on on voluntary contribution, nor does the protection of one citizen hamper the protection of other citizen. I'm sure you've heard of prisoner's dilemma. It's a classic game theory example. Two prisoners are kept in separate room, and they both are given a confession deal. The prisoner who signs the deal gets a lower sentence, and that deal becomes evidence to give the other prisoner a harsher punishment. Both prisoners know uh, that the other prisoner is given the same deal. However, if both of them sign the deal, both of them get the harsher punishment. Collectively, if they were in the same room, they both would have refused to sign it, and that is the best outcome if they both acted collectively. But separately, they don't know what the other prisoner is planning to do. Imagine being the prisoner if you refuse to. Uh, Imagine being the prisoner if you refuse to sign it, and the other one does. You get a harsher sentence. The other prisoner is thinking the same things. As a result, they both have a tendency to sign the deal, confessing to the crime. From the point of view of the prisoners, this is not an optimal outcome. Had the prisoners shown solidarity, they would be free. Public goods arguments are considered to be an extension of prisoners' dilemma. Collectively, we are all better off with a national defense, but individually, we would rather not pay for it. At least that's what the claim is. Now, before we use this theory as a basis for policy prescription of the government, we must first see if this theory has any descriptive value in explaining the past. And we see that the theory has some holes. Firstly, this theory that the free rider problem and non-rivalrous consumption has led to creation of public goods. If this theory was true, uh, we would observe a clear dichotomy between public and private goods in the past. There are many public goods that is goods that are produced by government help that could easily have been produced privately. In the we can find history full of examples like postal services, bus services, etc., which were all at some point of time or the other services monopolized by the state. But we know examples of postal services and bus services that are private. But there are also private examples of such services. Uh, I'm sorry, yeah, so there are also private examples of such services. So why did those goods acquire public goods character when they are neither non-excludable and non-rivalrous? There are also many private goods which have positive externalities, like private entities have no problem. There are also many private goods which have positive externalities, but private entities have no problem producing them, like education. We know education can be produced privately, yet it has a very vast amount of positive externalities. As an individual, I benefit from living in a society that is not full of ignorance. People who have knowledge tend to be better entrepreneurs than when they don't have that knowledge. I benefit by having a wide variety of goods and services that a market with good entrepreneurs can provide. I cannot exclude them from this benefit. If I am homeschooling or I don't have kids, I'm not funding the education industry at all. Historically, we know that the state forcefully took over the education industry rather than education being a public good from the start. In fact, we can find historical references of all the supposed public goods being privately produced. Even national defense was produced privately in our favorite examples, the medieval and Celtic and medieval Viking societies. Some of those first lighthouses were private, and today we know private security exists, so do private arbitrators. Their decisions are overridden by the governments, but they do exist. So we see that the logic of this false dichotomy between public and private goods do not stand the test of historical evidence. In fact, if we take the logic seriously, all goods having varying degrees of publicness or privateness, which depends on the perception of other people. Suppose I have a rose garden, and an example given by Hoppe. I privately tend to that rose garden. My neighbor gets to enjoy the smell, the smell and sight of my garden. He doesn't pay for its upkeep. If I build a marketplace next to your colony, the rent will go high. We all know how locality affects the rent, yet the landlords do not pay for the construction of the malls. The early investors in Gurgaon city all benefit from the private construction that took place after their investment, but they paid nothing. It was an entrepreneurial decision which would have backfired had Gurgaon not taken off. It is not surprising that there are many goods on which no such consensus exists, whether to call them public goods or private goods, even in mainstream economics. Now let us talk about the calculation argument. The government is supposed to collect direct and indirect taxes to invest in these public goods. How does the government calculate rationally how much of investment each public sector needs? Since it is not guided by the principle of profits and losses, how does the government know that we need more investment in public education or public roads? Sure, it would be great to have access to both roads and education, but we must remember that resources are scarce. If a particular resource is being used in the construction of public roads, it cannot be used elsewhere. Moreover, all these public goods, especially security, are multidimensional. Even roads is not a whole good. Should the government invest in building of roads in village A or village B? Which village needs roads more urgently? And finally, how does the government decide which private sector must bear the brunt of this taxation? For instance, IT sector has been given a tax holiday. How did the government decide that IT sector must be spared? Obviously, it was a hunch that IT sector is too important to tax, but then why is brick and mortar companies not important, especially for a country which has as little internet penetration as us? Ultimately, these decisions come down to politics rather than rationality. Sectors with more political influence are able to attain tax holidays while others remain taxed. The theory that certain goods would not be produced does not imply that they should be produced. If certain society fails to produce a public good, it doesn't mean that they don't need it. It just means that that it is not in their list of most urgent needs. If a society if in such a society, taxing the people, even if to provide them those public goods, would be less than optimal. And the government has no way of knowing this, because the only way the consumer really tells their preferences is by voluntarily paying for the service. If you say that certain public goods should be produced at the expense of other public or private goods, you need to justify that with at least with a theory of ethics. But no such theory of ethics even exists in the public goods literature. Public goods economists are therefore passing their own opinion as science. Now, all this does not mean that free rider problem does not exist, or it isn't real. It only means that it fails to explain the false dichotomy between public and private goods. The free rider problem is like any other problem on the market that the entrepreneur faces. Markets aren't perfect, that is true. Their success ultimately depends upon the entrepreneurs and their problem-solving skills. In the past, they have used technology, for example, to better solve the free riders problem. Broadcast TV was non-exclusionary. But the cable TV providers completely solved that problem and ultimately ended up replacing broadcast TV. But just because market is not perfect, it doesn't justify state intervention. Because the government is not outside the market. This is a hard concept to grasp, but simply government cannot break the laws of economics. If there is free rider problem in the marketplace, why can't it be there in the government? In fact, government intervention to solve the free rider problem causes even more free riders to exist. It worsens the situation. As we discussed, the calculation of allocation of resources for public goods ultimately comes down to politics, which involves political groups and lobbying. Both these political groups are not free from the economics of free rider incentives themselves. Take this for example. If there is a political group that advocates repeal of a particular tax, and they are able to get that tax repealed, a lot of people will benefit from that political action. But this lobbying for public benefit requires money and time to be invested, not necessarily as bribes, but even generating that political environment and media sensation requires money. But then all those people who benefit from that policy are not paying the lobby that got that passed. They are all free riders, which means that lobby groups that advocate policies in the interest of public are less likely to exist than special interest groups that lobby for policies that benefit a chosen few. And this fact is empirically well founded. Larger the group, all things being equal, less likely is it able to organize into a political campaign. Smaller the benefit of the campaign for each individual of the group, the more number of individual members are needed to make small contributions to make the campaign successful. Larger the benefit for individual members of the group, more likely is it that one person will be ready to fund the campaign and let others free ride. The democratic state therefore makes it much easier to enact policies that funnel great benefits to small groups than to enact policies that shower small benefits on larger groups. The, the politics of public goods are therefore more likely to be influenced by those special interest groups. You're more likely to find anti-tax lobbies that lobby for tax holidays for the select few, like the rich or particular industries or the licensed industry, than anti-tax lobbies that advocate repeal of taxes that directly affect the public at large, like income tax. As a side note, this also shows the idiocy of tax the rich policies because the government's ability to redistribute wealth depends primarily on its ability to distribute wealth in the first place. The distribution of wealth attained by the government then happens to be in accordance to the politics of smaller special interest groups. The Social Democrats ultimately face the paradox of increasing wage gap with increasing redistribution. Quite frankly, they end up advocating redistribution of wealth from the productive rich to the parasitic rich. Uh, that is from those who earned their wealth on the free market to those who lobbied for it. Anyway, so how does this relate to public goods? Remember that public goods are multidimensional. That is, when we speak national security, we can mean any number of things: defense equipment, offensive equipment, armed public militia, etc. When a group successfully provides itself a public goods through the market, the resources it expends pay directly for the good. In contrast, when the group successfully provides itself a public good through the state, the resources it expends pay only to the overhead cost of influencing the state policy. The state then finances the public good through taxation or some coercive substitute. When it comes to politics, you only need a few thousand rupees to influence policies that involve lakhs of rupees. Moreover, the groups that campaigned for the state-provided public good will not, in all likelihood, bear much of the coerced cost of the good. Otherwise, they would have had no incentive to go through the state anyway, because doing so would then cost more in total than simply providing themselves the good voluntarily. Instead, the cost will be widely distributed among the poorly organized large group, who may not benefit at all from the public good. This makes it possible for to uh, organized groups to get the state to provide bogus public goods and services which in fact cost much more than the beneficiaries would be willing to pay even if exclusion were possible and they could not free ride. In this manner, the state generates externalities and the ones that are negative. Rather than overcoming the free rider problem, the state benefits the freeloaders who receives bogus the state benefits the freeloaders who receive bogus public goods at the expense of taxpayers. For example, public of no country benefits from military expansion. In fact, if your country is threatening others, you are more likely to be invaded by the enemy country. But even if peace is a public interest, even trader interests, we find that nations go to war not always over resources but for frivolous reasons. Such a war becomes a threat to national security, and the biggest beneficiary of such a war has historically been international banks and weapons manufacturers, that which we call the military industrial complex. Even though the combined wealth of the public vastly dwarfs the wealth of these war lobbies, the public just doesn't invest as much in lobbies that stop the war. The free rider problem can supposedly explain that. In democratic state, voting is a free rider incentive. If I vote for a particular policy that benefits the public at large, everyone who did not vote is a free rider. The chances of your vote directly affecting the outcome of an election is very slim. Only in case of a tie does your vote truly count. This has been called government failures as opposed to market failure. But see, this argument, although valid, is just one side of the coin. While it is true that more money you have, the more you can influence political decisions, but it is just one aspect of the state. State has to maintain an image of governance so that it has to appear to implement policies that benefit the public at large. Which is why we don't see perpetual wars all the time in every nation. It is not war of all nations all the time. The free rider theory explains why wars against the interest of public exists, but it does not explain why wars do not happen all the time. It explains why so many people do not vote, but it fails to explain why people vote at all. It explains why our public places are littered, but it fails to explain why everyone doesn't litter public places. Civilization would not be possible at all if the people always behaved as the free rider argument says they do. So far, we have pointed out the any questions till now? Or anything to add? Okay. So far, we have pointed holes in the public goods theory, but that is not enough. We need to provide a better theory to explain why public goods exist. That is why there are some goods that only the governments provide. I mean, we need to explain why there are some goods that only the governments provide in most countries all over the world. An alternative explanation is the social consensus theory of the state. All states are legitimized monopolies on coercion. The crucial word is legitimized. This legitimization is what differentiates states from mere criminal gangs. Any society in which people refrain from regularly killing each other enjoys some kind of social consensus. No government rules through brute force alone, no matter how undemocratic. Enough of its subjects must accept it as a necessary or desirable for its rule to be widely enforced and observed. As David Hume has said, that every government, no matter how dictatorial, rests on the support of the majority. Very few people would pay their taxes if no penalties resulted from non-payments. which is why we say taxation is involuntary. But almost everyone accepts that taxation is necessary or just. This shows that taxation, even though coercive for majority of the society, has been legitimized. Of course, one reason why people think taxes are necessary is because people question who would provide the so-called public goods that apparently need taxation to run. All this proves, however, is that although public goods theory of the state is utterly worthless as an objective description of state's origin or nature, it is very valuable as an ideological rationalization for state's legitimization. And this legitimization of coercion is not just an element of the democratic state. Such legitimization existed under every state. The monarchical states had the divine right of the kings theory, and the communist states had their Marxist theory. The social consensus theory, if true, not only shows that public goods theory is useless in explaining the state, but it has actually caused harm to the social fabric of the society. If the entrepreneurs are groomed since birth to believe that they can't, shouldn't, or will not be legally allowed to provide public goods, they just wouldn't. They wouldn't even spend time thinking on ways to go around the problem of free riders, which we discussed. The public goods theory thus becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So now that we've gotten the public goods argument out of the way, let us bring our focus on national defense. Any questions or something to add?
Hey Shashank,
Yeah.
will a militia, a people's militia, be considered as a public good? Because in a people's militia, there will be, many people would be investing in arms and stuff, and there might be somebody, some certain guys who won't be purchasing any weapons or maybe pacifists, right? But if there is anything which goes on like crime or if there is a war or something, but the militia is going to take action.
Well,
Uh,
yeah, yeah. Go on.
will you consider this as a public goods problem, free riders problem?
Well, if you ask Hoppe, he'll say that all goods have a degree of publicness or privateness to them. Uh, if you try to explain public goods through the free riders argument, they could be free riders in any sort of private goods. I mean, we talked about education, and even education has the positive externality that the general public wants people to be educated, so it's a public good now. So what he says is that if the public at large cares for a particular good, then even the color of his underwear could become public good. so so instead of saying that a particular good is public or private, we should instead think about whether free riders exist in it or not. And naturally, yes, free riders would exist in a society of armed militia. If I'm living in a village where everybody is armed and I'm not armed, and everybody is by and large peaceful, and that village was attacked, I would probably not be joining in the defense of that village. Other people will be joining, those who have weapons, and I would be a free rider in that situation. So yeah, I would be a free rider, but that doesn't mean the militia would not exist. That is what where the free rider uh, argument fails. It fails to explain why public goods exist.
Okay.
Okay, so uh, when we talk of national defense, the goal is to protect life, liberty, and property of the people residing within a border from foreign aggressors. That is usually what people have in mind when they think and why they think it should exist. Unless we go down the path of nationalism like that was practiced by Hitler, this is what we usually have in mind. And there is nothing wrong with this definition. Everyone who, anyone who is a threat to someone's life, liberty, and property must be dealt with. However, historically, this has not been what we have received from the state. What usually passes off as national defense is protection of the state itself and its territorial integrity. That is, the state as a small collective of rulers is afraid that of losing control of capital, and whatever protection the state has provided to the life, liberty, and property of its citizen has simply been a positive externality of its actions. But but there are negative externalities too, both to internal and external defense of the nation. Even in defensive wars, the state sacrifices the defense of its subjects to the defense of itself. Such a universal measures as conscription, confiscatory taxation, rigid economic regulation, and suppression of dissent aggress against every citizen whom the state is presumably protecting. People believe the state defends their liberty. In fact, many end up surrendering much of their liberty to defend the state. Why is it that the state's interest in the public and the public interest do not coincide? As we discussed before, due to the free rider problem in governance, there form many special interest groups who would rather not lose their political power. And since these groups are the ones who get to control the national military as a public good, they utilize it towards the preservation of their political power rather than the protection of the life, liberty, and property of the public. The state has a strong incentive to provide national defense that protects itself and its prerogatives, but it has very weak incentives to provide national defense that protects its subjects' life, liberty, and property. Furthermore, there is a perverse inverse relationship between the people's belief that the state defends them and the reality. The political resistance against the domestic state's aggression decreases further as more and more people believe that the state protects them from foreign enemies. During the war, During a war, the state gets to impose various wartime policies that become the norm soon after. If the population believed that the state protects them, they are more likely to accept those policies. Nationalism thus results in an ironic paradox. It views the state as a protection agency, but this very view contributes to the possibility that the state will take on a literal role of a protection racket. Those who decline to pay for the state's protection become its victims. This in turn gives the state an added incentive to find foreign enemies. For without a foreign threat, the justification for the state's protection becomes far less persuasive. As for internal negative externalities, the state is very afraid of its subjects, especially of an armed rebellion. And not just because of their arms can hurt the state's agents. State survival depends on ideological consensus. An armed population is more likely to break out of that consensus when faced with tyranny of the state. Once the consensus starts to break, it is no longer about the show of gun power. Because of this disarmament, we make the members of the society not only vulnerable to internal aggressors, which might include the state itself, but external aggressors, which might include a foreign state. One interesting example, and possibly an exception to this rule, is the state of Switzerland. While it has compulsory military conscription, there are some elements of their defense system that are worth noting. Switzerland has one of the highest gun ownerships rates in the world. In past referendums have clearly rejected control. Since everyone is conscripted, every male undergoes compulsory military grade training. They are therefore required to keep military issued public weapon at home, personal weapon at home or the local armory. While some of the recent policies are questionable, one can easily see that this is the internal defense argument in reverse. In the case of Switzerland, not only is internal security strong, it is stronger than usual, whatever the usual is, making it not an easy target for invasion. Historically, Switzerland has been one of the most peaceful nations in Europe with no standing army. All it had was an armed militia comprising of almost all the males of Switzerland. I am not making a case for a national shift towards Swiss-style militia. This could easily go wrong. Military training for all could very well include ideological brainwashing, something that would make state really coercive. I don't want to point fingers, but there are some groups that want to do this in India with the brainwashing. What I am pointing out is that internal security, and by this I don't mean the police provided, but private security, that is, that could mean armed militia, is really important. While the state tries to control internal security, it cripples it. In fact, I submit that the difference between internal and external security is a false dichotomy. In every war, it is usually considered that there are two parties, nation A and nation B. One of them is considered to be an aggressor and another the defender. This thinking does two things. First, it axiomatically equates protecting the state with protecting its subjects. Secondly, it makes collateral damage during a war an acceptable norm. Any conflict between nations involves not just two parties but at least four: the state governing nation A, the state governing nation B, the people with the misfortune to live under state A, and people with the misfortune to live under state B. It is rare that the entire nations go to war. It is the states that do. To quote Rothbard, the state thrives on war, unless, of course, it is defeated and crushed, expands on it, glories in it. For one thing, when one state uh, attacks another state, it is able to, through the intellectual bamboozlement of the public, to convince them that they must rush to the defense of the state because they think that the state is defending them. Now let us focus on how a libertarian nation may defend itself. And this time we will be going with the idea that defense should mean protection of life, liberty, and property of the citizens rather than the protection of the political power. It is not surprising that the kind of authoritarian defense techniques that we see today did not come from the market. The market could never produce the kind of defense that we see today, and it is a good that it doesn't. People usually interpret this as a failure of free society. Obviously, an extreme decentralized defense force can be easily be crushed. So it is true that when we need some form of organization. So it is true that we need some form of organization when we're talking about successfully defending a free nation. But organization doesn't necessarily imply centralization. That is, a common command center, which is the only source of funding collected through taxation. What we need is organization with decentralization. We talked about such a decentralized security order in our first podcast, one that involved private security and insurance companies. We also talked about the disincentives for them to go rogue or go at war and the kind of market law that would develop around them. In this podcast, I will be talking not about the theoretical feasibility, which we discussed already, but the economic feasibility. Would it be possible for a free society to fund private security voluntarily without the need for a central taxing agency? We find that there are three ways to fund it. First is the profit motive. While it is true that that there is an issue of non-excludability, the market system incentivizes. Uh, while it is an issue that the national defenses can be non-excludable, but the market system incentivizes entrepreneurs to solve that problem. One who is able to solve it reaps very high initial profit. One way this could be solved is by combining national security with an excludable good like insurance against theft, like we discussed in podcast 1. Wars can do a lot of damage to life and property of the nation. So an insurance agency also who has insured a lot of life and property in the nation will have an incentive to provide national defense while earning profit from protecting against internal threats, which are excludable. If I don't have an insurance policy, theft of my property will not be replaced or investigated by an insurance agency, which makes this code excludable. One criticism that is given is that if there is a constant threat of foreign invasion, the protection agencies might form a permanent structure which could result in government that starts to take away liberties of the citizens. This has happened in the past with the Anglo-Saxon monarchs of the Middle Ages, who started out as military entrepreneurs but evolved into domestic dictators who thrived on taxation. But remember that the only way for such a collective to become a state is through the ideological support of the people. A consortium of defense agencies would lack the mantle of legitimate authority available to the king or government, which would make a power grab more difficult. Add to that the fact that the citizens of such nation would be armed, which we discussed is against the interest of someone forming a state. Second is through charity, that is donations. Charity could easily be a major source of defense funds, especially if it is about defense and not conquest of other nations. Third is through armed population, which can be very effective as it is in Switzerland, minus the conscription. A non-population is the ultimate safeguard for nation's liberty against the threats of both foreign and domestic. There could be a number of local neighborhood militias run by their members. They could be funded by mutual aid societies. The local militia could combine together to form a county level militia and then a nation level militia. There could very well be internal elections in deciding the commander and commander in chief. But the point is that such a militia would not have the authority to violate others' life, liberty, and property. They could not conscript people into joining them, nor tax others to fund them. They will still find funds from domestic law enforcement, or they could be on the retainer by insurance companies because, as we discussed, war can really damage life and property. And then there is, of course, the non-violent resistance. We are all very familiar with that concept, but I think it requires a level of solidarity that might not exist in the society. A lone person practicing it is not very effective, which takes us back to the free riders trap. But it has been successfully used in the past. Again, it depends on the situation or to situation. Mostly it is effective only against a coercive government that is usually thought to be legit, but the majority of population uh, mostly it is effective only against a coercive government that is usually thought to be legit by the majority of the population. What this tactic does is that it exposes the coercive nature of the government and helps break the social consensus that we talked about before. If you really want to read more on it, I suggest you read chapter 8 from the book. It is a nice read. I would like to end with a thought that chapter 8 ends with, and I have not thought of this before until then. Free societies tend to be very prosperous and better armed. They are politically stable and harder to defeat through treachery. I remember reading about how the English used to make all sorts of political agreements with medieval island agencies, thinking they have made a deal with the entire island. But they found it the hard way that there is no political authority to buy in that nation. The Machiavelli has I don't know how to pronounce that name. Sorry if I butchered it. He has written a book, Discourses on Livy, Livy, in which he argues that a free nation is the greatest possible threat to the freedom of other nations. Celtic and Viking societies we admire so much as libertarian models were among the most effective raiders and conquerors in history. what is to prevent our free nation from becoming a threat to the security of other nations. The military might of the US and their perpetual war, for example, is partly due to the government's ability to fund the military industrial complex using taxes, and partly because they have a level of production to support those taxes. Quite simply, US has been able to accumulate capital through the ages, and the prosperity has unfortunately become a source of governmental income. It is very unfortunate, but their past freedom and prosperity and the prosperity that resulted is funding their present military conquest at the expense of the capital structure, I might add, which is the US. What the US is trying to do is maintain the capital structure and fund their conquest through taxation. It is bad, obviously, for those being attacked, but it is also bad for the citizens of United States. Obviously, if they didn't have the ability to tax, the case would be different. But it explains the point. But maybe the solution that the free nations neighbors, maybe the solution is that free nations neighbors had better become free nations themselves. Okay. Uh, so with this I end. Does anyone else have anything to add? I've, uh, uh, what do you want me to discuss, Shika? Why don't you like join in and discuss it?
Uh, I'm basically wondering, like, these are things which it's quite difficult to use without harming mm, those, I mean, innocent bystanders and all.
What do you mean
So,
by talking about
um,
weapons of mass destruction?
not even mass destruction, even if localized small-scale destruction. I mean, they are not like tasers which we can, or guns which we can point out to specific individuals and just immobilize specific individuals. So, um,
True,
are you getting?
but yeah, I'm getting your point. But when you're talking about something in public view, the states have been one of the most reckless when it comes to war, especially United States, and it has used nuke only twice in the Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They came close to using it again. Historically, they've come close to using it in one or the other places, but what we need to understand about nukes is that it really has it has some practical applications as well. I've heard that nuclear explosion in the space is banned, but that could really accelerate space transportation. Uh, Other, I think, is that the hard mining industry could probably use it, but and of course the third is the nuclear reactor itself. Uh, when you're talking about when we talk about gun control, and we usually say that people should have the right to arm themselves and for the self-defense, it's usually said that what if they could they could arm themselves with the nukes or aircrafts and bombs and missiles and stuff. Well, the answer is then, well, why shouldn't they? As long as they're not aggressing on other people's property. But there is a catch in this. I
Okay,
mean,
I can see that. I mean, having a monopoly is always. I mean, having one caste system of so-called those who can and do control the WMDs. Having such a caste system is always one step worse than, I mean, in principle, allowing every everybody is. I mean, saying everybody doesn't make everybody capable of owning them. Obviously, it
yeah,
requires
no,
huge,
just because
humongous
something
amounts of
is
technology
legal
and
to,
expertise to. I mean, I understand that capital, technology, expertise, huge, humongous amounts of that is required to own. So it's not just
yeah,
we can declare that anybody will own that. That's not the point. What I'm trying to understand is the existing aircraft, the existing missile systems, and all that. Where would all that? I mean, how would all that be changing its ownership? And I mean, what kind of
Okay,
rearrangements would we expect to find?
It will be
so
homestead.
it will be homestead, yeah. So I'm not sure, Shikha, did you read that Alongside Night book? I mean, this is somewhere
No,
in the
I won't.
economics, but did you read that book?
See, I will give you an example of Switzerland
Not yet.
again. You have the Swiss army, right? Their people, I mean, every cantonment has their own private army and aircraft, air defense as well. So they select volunteers from them, like who should serve the police or who will join, who will take pilot training and stuff. And they keep an aircraft within I mean, within every, within every city or between certain strategic points where they have air bases. So they volunteer and they learn how to you know how to fly those aircraft and operate those weapons. So it's there. And the other thing is, what you look at the state is only the state expenditure of defense is only towards weaponizing, right? You have WMDs and weapons of mass destruction, but you don't have anything for civilian defense. Like you don't have nuke-proof bunkers. Like every civilian doesn't have access to nuke-proof bunkers. They do not have bulletproof waste or something. On the other hand, a private militia is going to not only, like if you're talking about, if somebody is like nuclear and very popular, you will also have jammers kind of things which look out for nuclear weapons, electronic jammers which are going to jam those weapons, and you will have nuke-proof bunkers and stuff over there. And the people who are possessing this kind of WMDs and stuff, they will be forced to, you know, but they won't be allowed to settle in certain kind of towns, or so there will be some kind of when the property is being sold or something, there will be some kind of checks where the people are going to object to that. Some kind of a mechanism is going to come out in that scenario. Like the other application that which comes in the future is nuclear power cars, which is already being being discussed and met in the future.
Voice is jittery. Um,
Is it better now?
yeah.
Yeah, what I'm saying is, like the people are going to come up with some kind of arrangement. Like for example, if you plan to start up a nuclear power station, so as per property rights, if you have taken the property before let's say, like if you remember, there is a discussion where Hopper talks about air pollution, right? Where you have a factory which is emitting smoke, right? So we decide like who owns the property, like who was the first, or where was the first ownership. So if you are owning some land and there is a nuclear weapon or a premise where you're going to set up a nuclear plant kind of thing, so that's a threat to you, right? It's a potential risk of having that kind of plant. It's like having a chemical plant or a potential polluting plant, right? So you're going to ask for, you naturally, by property rights, you get a right to stop that kind of a construction over there, right? You won't allow that kind of construction because it's a potential threat to you. Uh, as you were the initial owner of that particular land, like any land, you say you were the first settler over there, right? So if your adjoining settler is a potential harm to you, or it's going to put you at risk, then you have a right to object to that kind of setup. So anyone who is trying to create a nuclear weapons facility or a manufacturing facility have to go away, put those kind of things in a place, or they have to set it up in a place where there is no human settlements in the radius of where the nuclear, if there is a nuclear explosion.
I mean, we can
Yeah.
see that we see a lot of protests, and especially in Gujarat, there were protests, and they were setting up nuclear.
Here the government takes control, right? So the government doesn't work on that theory where who is the initial
Who is
owners,
there
right?
first, basically? Who is there first? That is the.
Yeah, because if you have a land, and in your adjoining land, if there is somebody who is polluting the air or stuff, planning to put up a factory, he doesn't have the right to do so, right? Because he is putting your rights into threat. So that's kind of, so the same applies for having WFDs.
Yeah, so the other thing is that like the when you're talking about someone owning a lot of heavy weapons and unlicensed weapons specifically, basically untrackable weapons. Let's not call them unlicensed weapons, but when someone has weapons that could be a threat to other people rather than just for defending, he becomes a person who is of interest to other protection agencies and other insurance companies, and naturally his own uh, premiums are going to be really high if he because ultimately he's going to need some insurance to do any sort of business with other people when he's so heavily armed. uh, who's going to trust him? And clearly, if he has weapons of mass destruction and if he tries to bring them in place where he's posing a threat to some particular property owners, they could obviously object to him bringing that weapon of mass destruction into the private colony. Anything else?
I don't have anything further to add.
Okay.